Most people think aging shows up first in the mirror. A few more gray hairs, a line near the eyes, skin that doesn't snap back the way it used to. That's the version of aging everyone talks about, because it's the version you can actually see and photograph and compare year over year. But the truth is, the visible version is usually the last thing to change, not the first. Long before any of that shows up on your face, something is already shifting inside your blood vessels, and it's happening whether you notice it or not, whether you're 25 or 65, whether you feel completely fine right now or not. Your blood vessels aren't just pipes carrying blood from one place to another. They're active, living tissue that adjusts constantly, deciding where blood needs to go and how much of it should get there in any given moment. When you exercise, they widen to send more blood to working muscle. When you eat a meal, they redirect flow toward your digestive system so you can actually absorb what you just ate. When you're trying to concentrate on something difficult, they send extra blood to the parts of your brain doing the heavy lifting. This isn't a passive system sitting there doing nothing until something forces it to react. It's constantly making decisions, thousands of times a day, and the molecule in charge of most of those decisions is one most people have never heard of. It's called nitric oxide, and as you get older, your body makes less and less of it. That single change explains a lot more than people realize. If you've noticed that you get tired earlier in the day than you used to, or that your legs feel heavier after a walk you used to do without thinking twice, or that your brain feels foggy by mid-afternoon even though you slept fine the night before, this is very likely part of the reason why. It isn't just stress, and it isn't just some vague, unavoidable slide that comes bundled with getting older. There's a specific, measurable mechanism behind it, something researchers can actually put a number on in a lab, and once you understand what it is, you start noticing its fingerprints everywhere in your daily life, in ways you probably chalked up to a busy schedule or a bad night's sleep. Here's what's encouraging about all of this. Nitric oxide production isn't fixed. It isn't something you're stuck with based on your genetics or the number of birthdays you've had. It responds to what you eat, sometimes within hours of eating it. So today I want to walk you through 5 things that have been shown to raise your nitric oxide levels, slow down the kind of vascular aging that makes you feel worn out, and in some cases actually start reversing damage that's already been done. But before we get to the list, I want you to actually understand what this molecule is doing in your body, because once you see it clearly, you'll never think about blood flow, energy, or aging quite the same way again. This isn't a quick tip you'll forget by tomorrow. It's a framework you can actually use for the rest of your life. Picture the inside of a blood vessel as a tube, and picture that tube lined with an extremely thin layer of cells. That lining is called the endothelium, and it's only one cell thick, which sounds fragile, but it's doing an enormous amount of work for something so delicate. Every single one of those cells is capable of producing nitric oxide on demand, and when it does, the message it sends to the surrounding muscle tissue is simple. Relax, widen, let more blood through. That message matters more than it sounds like it should. When your blood vessels widen, your blood pressure drops, which takes pressure off your heart with every single beat it takes for the rest of your life. Blood gets where it needs to go faster too, whether that's oxygen reaching your muscles during a hard workout or glucose reaching the exact part of your brain trying to focus on a task in front of you. There's a stress reduction effect layered into all of this as well. Blood moving through a narrow, stiff vessel creates friction and pressure against the vessel wall with every single pulse. Blood moving through a vessel that can widen and relax doesn't create nearly as much of that friction. So, in a very real sense, nitric oxide is the difference between a circulatory system working under constant strain and one that's actually built to handle whatever you throw at it, day after day, decade after decade. Think about what this actually means in practice. Every time your heart beats, roughly 70 times a minute if you're sitting still, it's pushing blood into a network of vessels that either helps absorb that force or fights against it. Multiply that by the number of heartbeats in a single day, and you start to understand why something as small as a molecule's ability to relax a blood vessel wall adds up to something enormous over the course of a lifetime. So what happens when your body starts making less of it? This is where things start to go downhill, and it happens slowly enough that most people never connect the dots until years have already passed. There are actually 4 separate warning signs that tend to show up as this decline sets in, and most people experience at least 2 or 3 of them without ever tracing them back to their source. The first is unexplained fatigue, tiredness that shows up earlier in the day than it used to and doesn't match how much effort you're actually putting out. The second is slower recovery, whether that's from a workout, a long day on your feet, or even just a poor night's sleep that used to bounce back by lunchtime and now lingers into the evening. The third is a mild but persistent rise in blood pressure, often the kind that shows up on a routine checkup and gets chalked up to age without much further discussion. And the fourth is the brain fog we mentioned earlier, that sense of mental static that makes focus harder to hold on to for as long as it used to. Individually, none of these 4 things sound alarming. They sound like ordinary life. But when you see all 4 listed out together and realize they trace back to the same underlying mechanism, it starts to look less like scattered bad luck and more like a pattern worth actually addressing at the source, rather than treating each symptom as its own separate, unrelated problem. As nitric oxide production declines, your blood vessels lose some of their ability to widen when they need to. That means blood pressure creeps up over time, even in people who consider themselves healthy and reasonably active. It means less oxygen reaching muscles during exercise, which shows up as fatigue that feels disproportionate to the effort you're putting in. It means less blood flow reaching the brain during periods of focus, which is part of why brain fog becomes more common as people move into their 40s, 50s, and beyond. None of this happens overnight. It happens gradually, quietly, while everything still looks completely fine on the surface, which is exactly why it goes unnoticed for so long by the people experiencing it firsthand. There's a second part to this that makes the picture worse. When the endothelium isn't producing enough nitric oxide, it also becomes more vulnerable to damage from the inside. Cholesterol and other debris can start working their way into the vessel wall itself, and your immune system responds to that the same way it would respond to any other kind of injury with inflammation. Except this particular inflammation doesn't resolve the way inflammation from a cut or a bruise eventually does. It sits there, low-grade and constant, slowly stiffening the vessel wall from the inside out, year after year, without ever really announcing itself the way a sharp pain or a visible wound would. Over time, this is how vessels that once flexed and responded on command turn into vessels that are stiff and unresponsive no matter what you ask of them. Think of it like a garden hose that used to be soft and pliable, left out in the sun for years until it turns rigid. It still technically carries water from one end to the other, but it doesn't flex anymore, and eventually cracks start to show along the length of it. When that kind of stiffening happens in a major vessel in your body, the consequences stop being about fatigue and start being about something far more serious. Blockages can form. In the heart, that can mean a heart attack. In the brain, it can mean a stroke. In the legs, in more advanced cases, it can mean tissue that isn't getting enough blood flow to stay healthy at all, which is about as serious as vascular damage gets. That's the version of aging nobody wants. And it starts with something as small and invisible as one molecule slowing down its production, 1 year at a time, decades before any of it becomes an emergency in a hospital room. But here's the part worth sitting with, because it's the whole reason I wanted to make this. This entire process is responsive to input, and food is one of the strongest inputs there is. There are compounds in ordinary, unremarkable foods that directly stimulate the same enzyme responsible for making nitric oxide in the first place. Some of them work by feeding your body the raw material nitric oxide is actually built from. Others work by protecting the nitric oxide you already have from breaking down too quickly once it's made. And a few work by triggering repair processes that go after damage that's already accumulated in the vessel wall over years. None of this requires a lab, a prescription, or anything you can't find at a regular grocery store on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. So let's get into it. There are 5 things I want to walk you through today, each one studied specifically for its effect on nitric oxide production and vascular health. And for each one, I'll tell you exactly how much you'd realistically need to see the kind of benefit researchers have actually measured in clinical settings. Number 1 is going to surprise a few of you, because it's something most people already have sitting in their kitchen and never once think of as medicine. Number 1 is beets. Beets are unusual because they're naturally loaded with a compound called dietary nitrate, and your body has the ability to convert that nitrate directly into nitric oxide. This isn't some slow, roundabout process either. When you chew beets, bacteria living on your tongue interact with that nitrate right away, and by the time you actually swallow, some of that conversion has already started. It finishes in your bloodstream shortly after, and the result is a fairly quick rise in nitric oxide, often within an hour or 2 of eating. There's something worth knowing here that almost nobody gets told, and it connects an unexpected part of your body to this whole system. That tongue-based conversion depends on having healthy bacteria living on your tongue, which means basic oral hygiene actually plays a role in how well this pathway works. If you've ever used a very strong prescription-grade mouthwash, the kind dentists hand out after a dental procedure, many of those contain an ingredient called chlorhexidine, and it's powerful enough to wipe out the exact bacteria this conversion depends on. Regular over-the-counter mouthwash doesn't do this to any meaningful degree. It's really the strong antiseptic kind that causes a problem, and the good news is your mouth does recover over time once you stop using it, usually within a matter of weeks. Clinical studies looking at beets have shown measurable drops in blood pressure after regular, ongoing consumption, along with real improvements in exercise performance. That connection makes sense once you think it through. More nitric oxide means more blood flow reaching working muscle, and more blood flow reaching working muscle means better endurance and less fatigue during effort. Some athletes have started using beet juice specifically before endurance events for exactly this reason, though you don't need to be training for anything in particular to benefit from the same underlying mechanism. As for how much you actually need, it's not a lot. 1 cup of roasted beets or 1 cup of beet juice provides a meaningful dose of dietary nitrate, right in line with what researchers have used in their studies to produce these effects. Number 2 is dark chocolate, and I promise I'm not stretching the definition of health food just to make you feel better about a snack you already enjoy. Chocolate starts its life as cacao, which comes from the seeds inside a pod that grows on a tree in tropical climates. Those seeds get fermented, dried, roasted, and eventually ground down into a powder. And that powder is where the interesting part of this story actually lives. Cacao contains a group of plant compounds called flavonols, and flavonols have a direct, well-documented effect on how much nitric oxide your blood vessels are able to produce. The mechanism here works in a couple of different ways, so let's slow down and walk through it. First, cacao flavonols stimulate the very same enzyme in the endothelium that's responsible for producing nitric oxide in the first place, meaning more of that relax and widen signal gets sent throughout your entire circulatory system after you eat it. Second, and this part is genuinely interesting even if you've heard some of this before, flavonols appear to trigger the release of stem cells from bone marrow into the bloodstream. Some of those stem cells travel to damaged sections of blood vessel and actually take part in repairing them. So, you're not only getting a temporary short-lived boost, you may be supporting real physical repair of vessel lining that's already sustained damage over the years, which is a very different kind of benefit than a quick spike that fades by dinner. Clinical research has connected cacao flavanols to measurable drops in blood pressure and improved dilation of blood vessels, both of which are meaningful, trackable markers for long-term cardiovascular health rather than vague feelings of wellness that are hard to pin down. The dose that shows up consistently across these studies is somewhere between 200 and 600 milligrams of cacao flavanols a day. In practical, everyday terms, that works out to about 2 or 3 small squares of dark chocolate, as long as it's genuinely dark, meaning 70% cacao or higher. Milk chocolate and even a lot of chocolate labeled dark at lower percentages simply doesn't contain enough of the actual plant compound to matter here. It's worth actually checking the percentage printed on the label rather than assuming, since a lot of what gets marketed as dark chocolate sits closer to 50 or 60%. Which doesn't get you into the range these studies used. If the bitterness of high-percentage chocolate isn't something you enjoy on its own, pairing a couple of squares with a cup of black coffee cuts the bitterness noticeably, and coffee brings its own modest circulatory benefits along with it, which makes the pairing a nice little bonus rather than a compromise. Number 3 is blueberries, and this might be the easiest addition on the entire list, since almost nobody has trouble eating a cup of blueberries a day if they actually have them on hand. The compound doing the work here is called anthocyanin, which also happens to be what gives blueberries their deep blue color in the first place. Anthocyanins act directly on the endothelium, triggering an enzyme called endothelial nitric oxide synthase, which is really just the technical name for the machinery inside those lining cells that produces nitric oxide. In human studies, researchers have measured this effect using a test called flow-mediated dilation, which essentially checks how well a blood vessel widens in response to a sudden increase in blood flow. It's a direct physical measurement of vascular resilience, not just an assumption based on how someone says they feel that day. And studies using this exact test have found real measurable improvement after consistent blueberry consumption. Sometimes in a matter of just a few weeks, which is a fairly quick turnaround for something you're simply adding to a bowl of yogurt or oatmeal. The dose that shows benefit is about 1 cup a day, and frozen blueberries work every bit as well as fresh ones since the anthocyanins hold up fine through freezing without breaking down. That matters if you're someone who buys in bulk and keeps a bag in the freezer rather than restocking fresh berries every few days. Now here's something that connects directly to what we've built up so far. Remember those 4 warning signs I mentioned earlier: the fatigue, the slow recovery, the creeping blood pressure, and the brain fog. Every single food on this list is working against the exact mechanism behind all 4 of them at once, which is part of why this approach tends to feel different from other advice you've probably heard about aging. You're not managing 4 separate problems with 4 separate strategies. You're addressing the one shared root underneath all of them with the same handful of foods. If that clicked for you just now, this is exactly the kind of connection I like digging into on a regular basis. And subscribing means you'll catch the next one of these as soon as it's out, instead of stumbling onto it later after the fact. Number 4 is barley, and I want to spend a bit more time on this one because it actually does 3 separate things for your blood vessels, not just one. The compound responsible is called beta-glucan, a type of soluble fiber found in barley and a handful of other whole grains, including oats to a lesser degree. The first thing beta-glucan does is lower LDL cholesterol, which is the kind that tends to accumulate along the walls of blood vessels and gradually narrow them over time. Less circulating LDL means less material available to build up inside the vessel wall in the first place, which directly reduces the risk of the kind of blockage that eventually leads to a heart attack or a stroke down the road. This is one of the more well-established effects on this entire list, and it's part of why oat and barley products often carry cholesterol-related health claims on their packaging. The second thing it does happen somewhere you might not expect, down in your gut. Beta-glucan feeds the bacteria living in your digestive tract, and when those bacteria are well fed, they produce compounds called short-chain fatty acids. Those compounds have a genuinely powerful anti-inflammatory effect that reaches well beyond the gut itself, spreading throughout the entire body. Since chronic, low-grade inflammation is one of the main things quietly damaging blood vessels over the years, anything that reliably lowers it is doing real, structural work for your circulation, even though the mechanism technically starts somewhere that has nothing to do with blood vessels at all on the surface. It's a good example of how disconnected different systems in the body actually turn out to be connected once you trace the pathway all the way through. The third thing barley supports is production of a protein called vascular endothelial growth factor, usually shortened to VEGF. This protein plays a role in maintaining healthy blood vessel lining and supports the growth of new, small blood vessels exactly where the body needs them most. Between the cholesterol effect, the inflammation effect, and the VEGF effect, barley is doing more structural, foundational work than almost anything else on this list, even though it's probably the least glamorous item here and the one people are least likely to think of first. As for how much you actually need, studies point to about 3 grams of beta-glucan a day, which works out to roughly 1 cup of cooked barley, easy enough to fold into a soup or a stew a couple of times a week without much extra effort or planning. Number 5 is apples, and I saved this one for last on purpose because it wraps together almost everything we've already talked about into one ordinary piece of fruit sitting in most people's kitchens right now, probably in a bowl on the counter. An apple contains a compound called ursolic acid, concentrated mainly in the skin, along with a compound called quercetin, found in the flesh and also present in onions and capers. These two compounds do several distinct things worth separating out one at a time rather than lumping together into one vague benefit. The first is a straightforward anti-inflammatory effect, reducing the kind of cellular stress that slowly wears down blood vessel walls over the years. The second is something called angiogenesis, which is the growth of entirely new blood vessels, and ursolic acid in particular has been shown to stimulate this process. That matters anywhere the body needs to heal, whether that's recovery from an injury, adaptation to consistent exercise over months, or repair following something as serious as a stroke or heart attack, where the growth of new small vessels can help preserve tissue that would otherwise lose its blood supply entirely. The third thing these compounds do is stimulate nitric oxide production directly, using the same basic mechanism we've talked about with every other food on this list today, bringing the whole thing full circle back to where we started. One practical note worth mentioning on apples: since the ursolic acid is concentrated specifically in the skin, and pesticide residue on conventionally grown apples has been shown in some studies to penetrate roughly 20% of the thickness of that skin, buying organic apples gives you a cleaner way to get the full benefit without that particular trade-off hanging over it. The skin also contains dietary fiber that feeds your gut bacteria, which circles all the way back to the same short-chain fatty acid, anti-inflammatory pathway that barley supports as well. It's a nice reminder that these 5 foods aren't operating in isolation from each other. They overlap and reinforce one another in ways that genuinely add up over time, rather than working as 5 unrelated, separate strategies you have to juggle independently. So that's the full list: beets, dark chocolate, blueberries, barley, and apples, 5 ordinary foods that each work on nitric oxide production through a slightly different mechanism and together cover almost every angle of vascular aging we talked about earlier in this video. None of them require a prescription. None of them require giving up your normal way of eating and starting over completely from scratch with some restrictive plan you'll abandon in a month. What they require is consistency, because this system responds to what you feed it regularly, week after week, not to something you do once and then forget about entirely a few days later. It's worth stepping back for a moment and connecting all of this to where we started. Aging isn't only what shows up in a mirror. Long before wrinkles or gray hair become noticeable, Your blood vessels are already having an ongoing conversation with everything you eat, deciding moment to moment how much they can widen, how much stress they're under, and how much repair work they're able to keep up with on any given day. When that system is working well, you feel it in ways that are easy to overlook, precisely because they feel like the absence of a problem rather than a positive sign you'd think to celebrate or notice at all. Steady energy through the day, quicker recovery after exercise, a brain that stays sharp longer without needing a second or third cup of coffee just to get through the afternoon slump. When that system starts to break down, you feel that too, just more slowly and less obviously, which is exactly why so many people write it off as normal aging instead of recognizing it as something that's actually responsive to change starting today, right now, with the next meal you eat. The 5 foods we covered today aren't a cure in the sense of fixing something broken overnight with one meal or one lucky smoothie. They're inputs into a system that's listening constantly, whether you realize it or not, and the sooner you start feeding it the right signals, the more resilience you get to hold on to for the years ahead of you. If you found this useful, the best thing you can do with it is put it into practice this week, rather than filing it away as something interesting you watched once and never returned to. Pick 1 or 2 of these 5 and actually add them to what you're already eating, instead of trying to overhaul everything at once and burning out on it by next Tuesday. Small, repeated inputs are exactly what this system responds to best. And that's true whether we're talking about blood vessels, muscles, or almost anything else in the body that adapts gradually over time rather than all at once. And if you want to keep learning how food interacts with the systems in your body that most people never hear explained clearly anywhere else, go ahead and subscribe. Drop a comment with which of these 5 surprised you the most, and share this with someone in your life who's been complaining about feeling tired or foggy without knowing why. I've got more of this coming, and I'll see you in the next one.